All right, well, welcome everyone again. We're here for Tracking Phenology, exploring the role of timing in nature with Amanda Wanlass. Am I saying your name right, Amanda?
You got it.
Okay. And Amanda is a certified local phenology leader and executive director of Indiana Phenology, which is a statewide nonprofit engaging people in documenting the seasonal cycles of plants in Indiana. So not only does she lead Indiana Phenology, she's also herbarium assistant at Butler University's Friesner Herbarium. And she has master's degrees in environmental science and public affairs from IU. And she enjoys reading, learning new things, spending time in nature, and playing board games. And she's going to be our speaker for the evening.
So I'm going to be talking about phenology, but we're going to start by talking about bird migrations. So we're in fall and it's the annual migration of the birds southward. And one night in mid-September, there were an estimated 247.1 million birds in flight. So what we're looking at right here is Birdcast, which is a really amazing tool if you're interested in birds. It's a collaboration of several different groups around the country, and it provides live data August through mid-November and March through mid-June on the bird migrations. So 2 weeks ago, about 50 million birds crossed Indiana in one night. 2 days ago, just a few thousand crossed, and there were fewer birds in flight over Indiana. But bird migration is phenology, and each year, thousands of sandhill cranes pass through Indiana. Click my slide there. They stop to feed, they rest, they congregate at various places in the state. And during the migration a couple of years ago, on November 28th in 2023, there were 32,938 sandhill cranes leaving their roost where they had paused for the night at Jasper-Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area in northwestern Indiana. So birds are really important and interesting, but you guys are all part of the Native Plant Society and you are all plant people. So the reason that birds and plants are connected is those birds have to have something to eat when they pass through, and their life cycles and their life cycle stages are very cyclical and happen at different points in the year, and they're key to different seasons, just like plants are. So right now we have the fall leaves that are changing colors, and both the fall color change on the plants and the bird migrations are part of the really exciting world of phenology. Phenology is really a key feature of life here on Earth. And even though that may be a term that you are not necessarily familiar with, it's really a concept that you see all the time. You see the phenology in the seasonal changes. You see it in the birds timing their nesting, so their eggs hatch in the spring when those insects are available to feed their nestlings. It's their insect emergence synchronized with the leaf out in the host plants. You have phenology with people where they're concerned in allergy season starting when particular flowers are in bloom. If you're a gardener, you time your planting to avoid frosts. You take into account the insect development and other stages of the plant when you're deciding how to take management actions in your garden and to care for your plants. And so phenology is something that is really important and it crosses different sectors. And so that's why I wanted to start with birds here. We're going to talk a little bit more about birds and plants and how they intersect in a moment. But to give you a definition of phenology, it's really focused on those recurring life cycle events in plants and animals. So in plants, we're talking about things like leafing and flowering and the ripening of crops. And in animals, we're talking about their development stages, what they're eating, what they're doing, and really their behavior. I like to think of phenology as the science of the seasons. It's the study of those seasonal cyclical changes that we call phenophases, as well as their timing and their relationships with weather and climate. So when you notice the seasons changing, what you're noticing is the unique phenology of that season. Phenology is also fundamental to our sensory experience of interacting with nature. It doesn't take any special equipment to observe. You don't have to go out of your way to look for it. Without trying, you just notice the phenology. So most obviously with our sense of sight, we notice phenology, but we also notice it with our ears. So you can think of those fall bird migrations. I always hear those sandhill cranes migrating long before I see them. We hear the sound of the crunching leaves underfoot during the autumn. If we go outside right now, there's a whole lot of that. My kids really like to jump on those leaves and get the biggest crunch that they possibly can. We experience it with our touch. We can feel those new leaves, how they're softer and thinner and more tender in the spring when they just emerge than the fully mature leaves. We even experience the same difference with our sense of taste. So some greens are nice and tender, sweet and tasty when they're new and fresh, but they become bitter and unpalatable as they age. You can also think of the fresh, ripe taste of tomatoes straight from the garden. We also experience phenology with our sense of smell. Each season has its own distinct smell. If you can think about it, right now, I'm sure you can conjure up that scent of autumn, but also think of spring with all of those flowers just opening up and blooming. So phenology is really what makes each season distinct. And what I really love about it is that it provides context to what we're seeing in a given moment. And it tells us a story and it helps us understand how what we see on a given day is really situated within the larger perspective of plant development in our case, as we'll talk about here today. So just to again reiterate here, phenology is those seasonal cyclical life cycle stages. So when we talk about phenology, we're talking about a specific stage, a point in its life cycle, whether we're talking about animals or whether we're talking about plants. And when we can also refer to each of those distinct stages that has a starting point and ending point as a phenophase. So when I mention a phenophase, that's what I'm talking about, a specific life cycle stage. And for plants, we're really focusing on the leaves and the flowers and the fruits. So phenology is literally happening everywhere there is life right now, from the largest plant, the largest mammal, down to even the smallest microscopic creatures. Phenology has to do with living things, and it's happening everywhere. And it's happening all the time, every season, whether you live in a place where there aren't distinct seasons, anywhere there's life, it's happening. And phenology really is all-encompassing in its impact. It plays a role in health. You can think about our allergies, as I mentioned earlier. You can also think of pest-borne diseases. So if you think of mosquitoes, for instance, when you're most at risk from mosquito-borne diseases is when at a particular stage in those mosquitoes' life cycle. The timing of different plant and animal activities, their phenology, impacts what recreational opportunities we may have at a given point in time, what required conservation activities there might be, and it even impacts the potential hazards and risks. There's a really interesting study out of California that was done that they were able to predict an increased risk for wildfires when a particular invasive grass reached a particular stage when it was dry and at the end of its life cycle. So phenology, like I said, it affects nearly all aspects of the environment. It affects the abundance and diversity of organisms, their interactions with one another, their functions in the food web, their seasonal behavior, and it even affects the global scale cycles of water and carbon and other chemical elements. It's also important for climate change science. Changes in phenological events like flowering or bird migrations are among the most sensitive biological responses to climate change because the weather and what happens on a day-to-day basis and the immediate environmental conditions around an organism are a big part of what cue it to move from one life cycle stage to the next. And
Sorry.
across the world,
Is
many
there
spring events are occurring earlier and fall events are happening later than they did in the past.
we
And
lost
how
your
plants and
presentation,
animals respond to climate
Amanda?
can help us predict whether their populations will grow or shrink, which really makes phenology a leading indicator of climate change impacts. And I want to go a little deeper in some of the specific events that I meant when I said that spring phenological events were occurring earlier. So scientists are seeing that they're occurring on average of 2 days earlier per decade than they did in the past. And we're seeing this trend toward earlier springs in 62% of the species that have been studied. So this is things like trees getting their leaves earlier, earlier flowering, earlier migration, earlier breeding of birds and amphibians, earlier emergence from hibernation. In short, all different species are responding to changing conditions by starting their spring activities earlier than they did in the past. So how did scientists figure this out? And I want to show you one interesting example here. So this is Henry David Thoreau. You may be familiar with some of his writing. One of his books called Walden Pond, he wrote while he was living in the woods surrounding Walden Pond, and he kept detailed records of the plant phenology in the area. So in recent years, some scientists compared his observations of flowering plants that he recorded in his journals to those same species and the time that they're flowering now around Walden Pond. And they found that on average, the species were flowering 7 days earlier than they did in Thoreau's time. So there are a number of reasons for this, but basically what it means is that the conditions around the pond were changing such that the phenology shifted earlier. So I want to pause here to note something really important. Without his valuable data set, we wouldn't have any information about what happened in the past. And so we wouldn't be able to see this change over time. So there's really great value in having detailed records about what happened at specific times for us to be able to draw upon and to understand change. And so his record, even though he wasn't taking it or documenting it for science per se, proved valuable to future science. And our records can do the same. We can record what we're observing on our own properties or out in nature right now, and we can contribute to science in the same way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But Indiana Phenology, the organization I represent tonight, is dedicated to making sure that biodiversity and phenological research like this is happening in Indiana. And we're working with volunteer observers to gather baseline information relating to the leafing, flowering, and fruiting of plants all over our state so that we have this local relevant data about Indiana so that we can understand what's happening here in Indiana. So this is just one example of how scientists figured these kinds of things out. And I want to talk about a specific example of why it matters, why you should care. So if you remember where I said 62% of the species were changing earlier, that means that there are a significant number of species that aren't starting their spring earlier. And we know that in any particular ecosystem, the plants, the animals, the insects, all of those pieces of that ecosystem are interconnected and have relationships with each other. And this is one example where that relationship gets interrupted. So in a good year, we've got this migratory bird. It comes back in the spring. It lays its eggs. Those eggs hatch just at about the time that the birds hatch out of their eggs. And so there's abundance of caterpillars. So the birds can feed their nestlings and life is wonderful. But what we're seeing with changing conditions is that the tree is starting its spring earlier, or it gets its new leaves earlier. The caterpillars are hatching, or they're emerging earlier so that they can take advantage of those tender young leaves that they feed on. And the birds themselves, however, are not shifting their timing. So those migratory birds that are cued to to migrate by conditions in their nesting or in their wintering grounds, come back at the same time that they normally have, but spring has started earlier in their breeding grounds. And so that peak of abundance of the caterpillars has shifted. And so when the birds come, they lay their eggs at the normal time. And when the nestlings are ready to eat those caterpillars and feed on those caterpillars, the caterpillars have already come and gone and moved off onto their next life cycle stage, which means that those nestlings don't have enough to eat. And scientists have studied, in one case, in this one study here that I'm showing you a picture of, 9 different songbirds, where they saw this mismatch between the birds and their food source. And this resulted in declines in bird population. The survivability of the nestlings went down. And so when this is just one example of why it's a problem when species respond differently to differing conditions, because when the interrelated life cycle events in different species are no longer aligned, that's a mismatch. We call that a phenological mismatch. And with the birds and the caterpillars, if the birds aren't keeping up with the changing conditions, and if they aren't keeping up with the change in the caterpillar life cycle, that just disrupts the food web. And you can imagine the same type of mismatch happening in all sorts of different ways in our ecosystems, and it is decidedly problematic. We're seeing disruption of food webs and the rhythms of life in lots of different ways as a result. All right, so kind of a sum up slide right here. Why is phenology important? Well, those environmental conditions affect the timing of life cycle events, as we've learned. And when the changing environment occurs, that changes the phenological timing. And those changes to phenology can affect the interrelated components of the ecosystem, and they also affect the humans that depend on those ecosystems. So that's why phenology matters and why we're talking about it tonight. But I want to dig a little bit more into specifically plant phenology. So you can observe phenology at many different scales in nature. We can talk about phenology at a landscape level. We can think of trends in spring leaf out across the state, beginning in the south and progressing northward. We can talk about phenology at the community level. We can watch spring arrive to our gardens, our neighborhoods. We can notice the order in which the plants wake up. First, there are those spring bulbs, then, certain weeds pop up, and then, things move on from there and so forth. We can also talk about phenology on an individual level. So we can talk about the progression of development of a single plant. You can start with the germination, its leafy growth, its first flower, all the way through to fruits developing, ripening, and so forth. And we're going to take a look at phenology at each of these different scales. So let's start with phenology at the individual level, and that brings us back to phenophases again. So really understanding these different life cycle stages, these different structures of a specific plant can help you make better informed decisions if you're caring for them in your garden. It can help you with plant selection, cultivation, pest management, and really just help you understand and learn more about those specific plants. All right, so these are the vegetative phenophases that there are. There's breaking leaf buds, or if it's something that dies back down to the ground, or some new seeds that are sprouting, we've got initial growth. Then we have the increasing leaf size phenophase when those leaves grow bigger before they're fully mature. We have the leaves phenophase, and that's the one that stretches for the longest point in time, which you see on a plant. The leaves are on there for the longest length of time as far as the phenophases go. Then we have, the colored leaves. They change their autumn colors, and then we have falling leaves. And these phenophases can overlap. So you can see here, this is the example of a deciduous tree and its phenophases depending on the specific species of plant that you're thinking of, these different phenophases, these different bars would be different sizes. They may shift a little bit and overlap in different ways, but you see the breaking leaf buds and then the leaves start opening. There's a period of time at the beginning where you've got the increasing leaf size, and then you've got the colored leaves and the falling leaves in the fall. So this is not anything that's new to you, but this is just a way to conceptualize it and think about it and put the pieces together. All right, so then we have our reproductive phenophases, and this includes everything from the flowers all the way through to the ripe fruits. So we have those flower buds, the development of those flowers, and we have the open flowers stage where you can see the reproductive parts and they're receptive to pollination. There's also the pollen release phenophase. When we are collecting data on phenophases, we collect the pollen release phenophase for those plants that are allergens. Because understanding when a plant that's an allergen is releasing that pollen gives you information on when that allergy season starts and how long it's going to last. And it's useful to track changes in the length of that allergy season, and also understanding the overlap in which particular species that are allergens are causing us distress through allergies. Then we also have the fruit phenophase, where that's developing fruit, and then the ripe fruit, and then all the way through to when those seeds are removed from the plant, either from wildlife or humans, or when they drop off the plant, depending on the particular species. And here again, this is one example of how these phenophases may line up and overlap. You can have a plant exhibiting multiple phenophases at the same time. So you can say there is one fruit that is in the developing fruit stage, and there is also another one on that very same plant that's already ripened. So that is there. At Indiana Phenology, we collect data on the timing of the plant phenophases. We use a platform called Nature's Notebook, which is a project of the USA National Phenology Network. So we use their tool called Nature's Notebook. It was designed to provide a user-friendly platform for collecting these kinds of observations in the field, and it's used by ordinary people, and it's also used by professional scientists across the country. And observations that are made using this platform become part of a national phenology database. They have 1,200 or more than 1,200 different species of plants and animals you can monitor using their monitoring protocols. And what I love about it is it gives you a really easy way to keep track of when things happen. So I moved to Indiana about 15 years ago. And when I moved here, I was really interested in how the timing of things was different from where I had moved from. And so I tried to keep records on my own, and I had a little journal that I wrote them in. And I love Nature's Notebook because it makes it really easy to collect that data. So when I learned about it, it was like, okay, no more notebooks. I don't need to keep us on paper anymore. I'm going to use their free app. And it just is a series of questions that it asks you, and you answer yes or no. And that yes or no answer is the data that we're collecting. And so you can see here an actual data sheet right there. So it's pretty easy, pretty straightforward, and it helps you collect some really useful, interesting information. Click in there. So I want to just show you how easy it is to track phenology this way. And so we're going to practice it right here with Eastern Redbud. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, these are all pictures of Eastern Redbud. It gets its beautiful magenta flowers in the spring before the leaves pop out. And they're this gorgeous, unique heart shape. In the fall, they're on a good year, they're a vibrant yellow, and their fruits look like these pea pods. And when they're ripe, they turn a nice brown like that. Okay, so here is a picture of eastern redbud, and we're going to walk through answering all the questions. You can do it on your own in your head, and I will talk us through it. So, do we see breaking leaf buds in this picture? You can see some buds over here, but those are actually flower buds. So no, we don't see any breaking leaf buds. Yes, we see leaves. We've got those heart-shaped leaves in the background. Do we see increasing leaf size? That's hard to tell, but I can tell you those are definitely the mature leaves. So we do not see increasing leaf size. We do see colored leaves. There's one down here. There are a few up in there. We can't tell about falling leaves. So another awesome thing about Nature's Notebook is you can answer with an I'm unsure. So that's that question mark on there. So in this case, I think we'd answer unsure because we can't tell. Do we see flowers or flower buds? Yes, we do. Those pink things right in the middle. And there might be one flower that's open right here. It's hard to tell. So we could answer with a question mark again there. Pollen release, nope. And do we see fruits? Yes, we see a fruit right here sticking out in the foreground and another one right there. And they are brown and ripe. And again, recent fruit or seed drop, we can't tell because we don't see the ground. And so we're going to answer unsure on there. So it just takes 2 to 3 minutes per plant that you monitor in this way, particularly when you really get into it and are familiar with the process. And it's quick and easy. And with the platform, you can create these really awesome Phenology calendars. So I want to talk about those for a few minutes. So what you see here is along the bottom is a timeline. It goes from January to December. And we have on the top row, the green bars are leaves. The middle bar has to do with flowers, and the bottom bar, the pink, has to do with the fruits. And so each colored bar that you see, it indicates a yes, a time somebody went out and looked at this eastern redbud and said, yes, I see this on that plant. And so just looking this really quickly, you can tell that it gets its flowers before its leaves come out. You can tell that the fruits persist through the winter and are on that plant for a good long time. We're looking at just does it have fruit, so not necessarily whether they're ripe or not. And then you can also see that it starts its flowering sometime between March and April. And so Phenology calendars are really amazing tools that make it easy to see that whole life cycle of a plant at a specific point in time. And with some trying to decide whether you have a particular species in front of you. And when you're doing plant ID, in some cases, it's helpful to know what its typical flowering period of time is. That's one way you can say, yeah, I don't have species X because I know it flowers earlier or later than when you might be looking at it. So Phenology calendar helps you in that case as well. So here it can help us tell when we should expect redbud flowers, whether we should see them in the fall. No, we don't see any bars there. It can tell us, when we first see them and whether it leaves or flowers first, as I was just talking out. You can also use Phenology calendars to compare years. So on the left, I've got a Phenology calendar that we already talked through. On the right, I'm just pulling over the flowers. So now we're just looking at the flowers for 3 different years. So we've got 2019 on the bottom, 2020 in the middle, and 2021 on the top. And I put a line, a vertical line at April. So you can see really easily that between those 3 years, there was quite a bit of variation in the starting of flowering for eastern redbud because it's very much cued toward the weather and temperature conditions in the early spring, and it's ready to go when those conditions are right, starting in March. But sometimes we don't hit those right conditions until mid-April, as it was the case in 2019. Something else is really interesting here is you see in 2019 some flowering between September and October that you didn't see in any other years. And in 2019, some redbuds did have a second fall flush of flowers. And in fact, that picture up at the top was from 2019 in the fall, which is why you see those pink flowers and all of those leaves, even some of those colored leaves in the background in that picture. That was from Franklin, Indiana in 2019, but I've also seen it up here in Carmel, where I am, and in the middle of Indianapolis as well, and some other years. And when you're using a phenology calendar, you can see those kind of interesting, odd events popping up. It also can help us compare species. Here we put a spring ephemeral on the left and a summer bloomer on the right. I'm sure you're familiar with these particular species, but what you can see at a glance is that they have very different life cycles and life cycle strategies here. The spring ephemeral does everything. It's leaves, flowers, fruits, the whole life cycle over the course of just a few months in the spring, hence its name. And the summer bloomer has very different patterns, as you can see there, and a phenology calendar really makes it easy to see that just at a glance. These phenology calendars were created from the data that was collected through Nature's Notebook and are from here in central Indiana. All right, so I want to move to talking about phenology at the community level now. And I want to talk about a different platform that we use that you may or may not be familiar with. iNaturalist is a second citizen science platform that we use. It's designed for sharing photographic evidence of biodiversity. You don't have to know the name of what you're observing. You don't ever have to observe that same thing again. You just use it to document interesting things that you find. They have an active online community that collaboratively helps ID observations. So it's a great way to work on improving your ID abilities, to put observations up on iNaturalist and then see that back and forth, and also explore observations that other people have made. And it's different from Nature's Notebook, that other platform we just talked about, in two ways. It's based on sharing photographs of what you see, and then it's focused on biodiversity, which means you don't make repeated visits to the same location like you do with Nature's Notebook. So one thing that I love using iNaturalist for is to get a better feel for what particular plants that I know really well when they're flowering, but not so well at any other point in their life cycle, for getting a good feel of what it looks like throughout its whole life cycle stage, and also for looking forward to what should I be seeing soon, or what should be flowering next, and questions like that. So you can go and explore all of the observations. There are millions of observations that they have in iNaturalist. I'm going to walk you through a couple examples here. In this case, I filtered this for a particular county. So this is Morgan County. You can see all of the iNaturalist observations there. They had 22,726 observations made in Morgan County over the whole period of time that iNaturalist has data. If you were to look at our county, Marion County, there are a lot more, but you can see that there are observations of 3,377 in this county, and so on and so forth. And so actually, if you look right here, you can explore observations by looking at the map, which we were just looking at, but you can also see a grid. So when you use the grid version, it shows you the newest observation, the most recent observation. And you can see that that was at the time that I pulled this picture, these pictures of moths and some other flowering species. You can also have it give you a list view where it gives you a little bit more detail, and also again shows it from the most recent observation and on down. It also has some really powerful filtering tools. So you can filter it to just show you a particular type of organism. So you can have it just show you birds, you can have it just show you fish, just show you fungi, just show you plants, and so forth. You can also filter it by a particular month over here. And I really love using this filter by month version. So in this case, we're going to filter it by September. And what it does is it gives you a really quick view of what kinds of things are in what life cycle stage in September. In this case, you can see that the leaves are starting to change. You can see some fruits that are ripening. You can see some flowers that there are. And so it's a really good tool to help you learn more about plant ID, get a better feel for the names and timing of different plants. And it's showing you actual pictures of actual plants here in Indiana, which is incredible, because sometimes you look in a field guide and it may have pictures of the plants, if it does, but they're not always they don't always match exactly what you might be looking at when you're trying to ID a plant, because there's a lot of variation. And so in this case, I used the filter again, and I filtered it to just show me white snake root. And it's no longer, well, you were still filtered for September. And so you can see all of these different pictures of what white snake root looks like here in this case. And so I was filtering it for September, but you can also go look at what it looks like in April, August, and so forth. So you can filter it by species, and you can see that progression through those phenophases and the life cycle. You can see when it's just brand new, when it's budding, those ripe, or those all the way to those ripe seeds there. And it's just a great tool for getting a good feel for what things look like and expanding your information. Okay, so let's move on and briefly talk about phenology at a bigger scale. And clicking there. So we're going to look at the whole continental US as our bigger scale here. So a little bit bigger than landscape. But what we're looking at right here is a map of when spring arrived in the US. This map is called the Spring Leaf Index. It's a model of when spring leaf out occurs in the country. It was developed using decades of observations of the timing of leaf out for lilacs and honeysuckles, cloned lilacs and honeysuckles. So there's widespread, not native, but they're among the earliest woody plants to leaf out. And this model takes the current temperature conditions and it predicts when leaf out is going to occur based on historical relationships between the leaf out and those spring temperatures. And it has been verified to be very accurate for matching what we actually see. So we're seeing spring arrive as defined by those first plants leafing out. And this is interesting-ish, but it's not particularly informative in the context of climate change or for us, because there's natural variation from year to year. And this doesn't tell us anything about how this year compares to other years. So what we really need to know is, how does this compare to the past? Are we seeing spring earlier this year versus other years? And we have another map that helps us explore that. The second map is called the Spring Leaf Index Anomaly, and it shows how this year's spring leaf out deviates from the long-term 30-year average in days. So this looks different. We've got a little bit more interesting stuff going on here. Dark red is 20 or more days early. Dark blue is 20 more or more days late. So we've got those two different scales. The lighter it is, the closer to normal that particular location was. And what becomes immediately obvious is that there's a distinct regional variation in the timing of spring. And this particular year, we have this interesting red, white, and blue patriotic striping pattern going on in the eastern half of the US. And then we've got a much more patchy, swirly pattern going on with early and late areas right next to each other out in the west. And this, if you look at this map going back several years, each year has a very different pattern. And it varies from year to year, but it always shows regional differences. There's something distinctly regional about this. We never see everything across the country being earlier or later. Okay, so if we look at Indiana, we see that Indiana has a lot of red. this year, which means that it was early. There was a lot of earliness in this particular year, up to a week and a half early in some places, which sounds like it's really early, but is it? So because there is natural variation in when things happen, we need a little bit more context to be able to determine whether it was actually very early or it was just normal early. So we're going to look at a third map here. And this map gives us an insight into how unusual a particular amount of deviation is from the average. And again, we're looking at spring leaf out still in the United States. We have two different color scales. Again, the blue purpley color relates to places that are late, and the green scale relates to places that are early. And so in Indiana, we see some green in there. But if you look, it's not really dark green, which means we see this amount of variation in spring, earlier, later, every couple of years. So this year's spring, though it was early, was not particularly unusual. It was not unusually early. Just a few years ago, we did have a very early spring where some places had a spring so early that we only see it that early once every 40 years. And so just like each state has its unique history and culture, and each location has its own unique climate trends, it's really important to rely on local conditions and local information and local research, local data to be able to understand what's happening. So if we tried to understand how climate change was affecting Indiana by looking at California or Oklahoma, we would not be getting accurate information because what's happening in Indiana is very unique, very different to where we are. And having local knowledge means we have stronger science, healthier ecosystems. We're really better able to take care of what we've got. All right. Okay, so we're seeing spring happening earlier. We're seeing, we know that phenology is an indicator of climate change. Different areas are changing at different rates. Different species respond to change in unique ways and at different timings. So if we want to know what's happening here in Indiana, we need to study what's happening here in Indiana. And that is what we do at Indiana Phenology. So just to remind you, changing phenology matters. We really care about this because it changes the interrelated components of our ecosystem, and it is a problem. So remember Thoreau, how the real value of his phenological records was having those detailed records of historical information. Our records can do the same. And when we record what we are seeing, that really makes it possible for us to see change over time in the future. And if we don't document what's happening now, we won't be able to see that change in time. We won't be able to document that change in time. And Indiana Phenology is a citizen science organization. Citizen science or community science, it goes by lots of different names, is really just scientific research that's conducted by people who aren't paid to do it. And average people are doing science. It's also called volunteer monitoring, participatory research. Each different type of citizen science has a slightly different flavor and different traditions, but all in all, basically it's average people doing science. And our organization is really dedicated to making sure that this data, phenological research is happening here in Indiana. And we do that with the help of volunteer observers. And I'd like to invite you to help us to document how our ecosystems are changing and how our nature is changing here in Indiana by participating in our programs. Our mission is really to increase science-based environmental stewardship by empowering Hoosiers of all ages to participate in this data collection. We work with individuals, groups, and schools. We worked with, we had a really fun day-long program that we did with some Girl Scouts a couple of years ago. We helped teachers set up observation sites on their school grounds, and we help nature preserves and parks and similar organizations start long-term phenology monitoring projects. And then we have individuals and families that collect this data on their private grounds. We have data in 40 different counties of Indiana. We hope to cover all 92 counties eventually. We have about 350,000 phenology status records that we've collected over the past 6 or 7 years. So we're just starting to be able to see trends over time. And we also have some really interesting projects where we're looking in some historical records. So there was a nature study club in central Indiana, in Indianapolis, in the 1920s that did a phenological survey of wildflowers. And so we've been going and looking at their records from 1927 and 28 and pulling that phenology data out of it. And we're going to compare that to what we're seeing with those same wildflowers in our time. And then we will be able to see how the timing has changed over those 100 years here in central Indiana. We have some informal records from journals that people have collected that we are transcribing and pulling out this information. So we're also not just documenting what's happening now, but we're pulling stuff from historical records that we can find, and so that we can make that time series, see how things have been changing. And we really need people to help us document what's happening now. Use the 2 platforms we talked about, Nature's Notebook and iNaturalist. Essentially, you go outside, you look around, you find interesting things, and then you share what you're seeing. And by using Nature's Notebook or iNaturalist, you are sharing it with scientists. So not only are we using those platforms, but scientists across the country and across the world are using those platforms to study all sorts of really interesting research questions about plant phenology. And those are those 2 platforms I mentioned. Again, it's really easy. You just use, it's just yes or no questions that you're answering. It's something that's accessible to all ages. We even have had some elementary school students that participated, and even 4-year-olds are able to, with some training, to be able to accurately answer these questions over time. So I'm going to skip over that slide and take us down to this one. Really, there aren't any special skills. If you can tell the difference between each of these 4 pictures here, then you have everything that it takes to be able to document phenology and participate in collecting data for science. You just have to be able to recognize different stages of a plant's life cycle. And it's something that the more that you look closely at it, the more that you learn. And it's fun. So to bring us to the end here and wrap up, in addition to the benefit to science that occurs from documenting phenology, there are so many personal benefits. You learn skills, so it increases your personal learning. You develop a connection from deeply observing a specific place. You have all those physical and mental health benefits of spending time outdoors. You better understand your own garden if that's where you're making observations. And then there's also this, that special pleasure that comes from record keeping. And it's a pleasure that benefits future generations. And record keeping on its own is wonderful, but it's even more impactful when it's shared. As we saw today, these records have the potential to provide us with important insights into how our ecosystems are functioning and responding to changing conditions, and which can help point the way to how we can manage and mitigate the impacts of climate change and other changes for the good, not just of humanity, but for all of our fellow living creatures here on Earth. And with that, I will end and we can take some questions.
Thanks, Amanda. That was really fascinating. Greg put a question in the chat, I think, alluding to the Nature Club. Is that Blatchley?
I believe that is a name associated with it. It was the Indianapolis Nature Study Club, I think is what their name was. And they were around until the 1980s, I think. So it was a long-lived club.
Amazing. I have a question, Amanda. Do you advocate just choosing, for starters, like choosing a particular plant in your yard, or where would you begin if you're just a novice at this tracking?
That is a really great question. If you want to begin with Nature's Notebook, so doing that regular visits to the same plant, I recommend that you come to our training. But whatever you pick to observe, just pick something that you're interested in. So in my backyard, I have some of my fruit trees that I observe. I also have some of my spring ephemerals, and then some of those other natives that I have planted because I'm really invested in, how they're doing and when they're doing things. So whatever you're interested in is what I would recommend. I see a question there. How do we sign up? If you go to our website, you'll see our events page has our currently scheduled trainings. You can also email us and we can give you that information. And a question about Thomas Jefferson keeping detailed records. Yes, there have been some use of his records for changing phenology. I do not have, I'm not familiar with the details of those particular studies, but yes, I do know his records have been used. And there's a question from Greg. I'm not sure I understand the question.
He's asking who was the photographer of the photos that did not have a little credit listed. Was that you?
Most of those, there are two things that either they came from Canva, which, as far as I'm aware, did not need to be credited, or they were my personal photos.
And was that your kid with the acorns?
That was my kid with the acorn.
So
yeah.
cute.
During COVID. So she's a little bigger now.
It was really great. Fascinating.
Well, thank you for letting me talk. I'm always happy to talk phenology with anyone. It's also fun to go out and do a phenology focused hike where you look for what particular phenophase life cycle stage all the plants are in, and then repeating that in each different season to get a feel and really look for what's different about each season in a particular space.
Nice. We need to partner with you on getting out there. That would be
I love that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're getting some thank yous in the chat. We have just a couple minutes left, but I'll take the opportunity to invite everybody to an in-person event at Woolly Yak on October 19th. So we did this last year, and it's just a time to come together and enjoy your fellow plant lovers and have a good time at a place called Woolly Yak Farms. It's in Noblesville, I believe. So watch your email and the Eventbrite channel for that information and sign up. It's unlimited attendance, so you all can come. Oh, Greg has another question. Can you tell us about your work at the herbarium?
I could tell you a little bit about it in a minute, but that's also something that I think would be interesting for a lot of Native Plant Society members to hear more about. What it is basically is pressed plant samples, historical pressed plant samples, and also some current ones that are documenting that a particular species was found in a particular location at a particular time. And what I do is anything from mounting some of those new specimens that get sent in from some of the botanists that are collecting around our state right now, to mounting them on paper. That's essentially, I call it Arts and Crafts Day at the herbarium when I do that, to filing them in the cabinets and to make sure that they're appropriately identified, that I work on the keeping the database up to date. We're also working on digitizing all of our specimens so that you can see them online as well. But it's a lot of fun, and it's a really amazing resource, again, of historical records. I'm happy to talk more about that another time.
Yeah, we bring you back for a Marion presentation. That'd be very cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Pleasure having you all with us on a Wednesday night. And with that, we will, unless you have any closing words, Amanda.
Thank you for letting me talk. I enjoyed it.
You bet. We appreciate it. All right. Bye, everyone.